importance of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and, the group that went south, and why,
Sure.
where the judgment was that led to that according to your beliefs?
Okay. Well, by the time of the Roman occupation, you had already gone through, we had already gone through numerous captivities. And so when you look at the Roman occupation, that was simply a very violent and physical destruction. And when that occurred, the destruction of the temple, the smashing of the Hebraic idea, the hiding of the scrolls down at Qumran, etc., we went into exile. Now, logically, if you have a military power, an oppressive military power coming from the north, it wouldn't make good common sense to flee to the north. And so our position is that many, if not most, of the Israelites that remain, and particularly Judah, went south. We migrated down both banks of the Red Sea. We migrated down the Nile River. We migrated across North Africa and then down into the southern areas, into what is now called the Western Coast. And so when you look in Ghana, for example, you will find that the Ashanti, the Ewe, the Yoruba, and Igbo in Nigeria, present-day Nigeria, that all of these different ethnic groups have Hebrewisms, what one scholar called Hebrewisms, cultural similarities to the ancient biblical Israelites. Circumcision on the 8th day, linguistic connections, name similarities, separation of the women during menstrual cycle and after childbirth, etc., etc. Well, our whole presence in America was part of a divine chastisement. America for us could only be a land of captivity.
One of the ways in which Judaism has come to the fore in the last 50 or 60 years is because for many Africans, Judaism is uncontaminated by the crimes of colonialism. For them, Christianity is a white religion. It's the religion of the colonial masters. It's full of traditions which are intensely European. But for them, Judaism is not. It's neither contaminated by colonialism, nor is it contaminated by anything to do with the slave trade. So it seems pure, it seems authentic, it seems to speak to their own traditions, it seems to speak to their heart.
All right. Shalom, family. Shalom. Welcome back. All right. Started off today with a quick preview of a few videos that gives us some pretty good insight of, the history surrounding some West African tribes, how they have Hebraic origins, Hebraic traditions, familiar language, and even as Tudor Parfit stated, Blacks or sub-Saharan Africans, they looked at Judaism as something that's their own, something that was uncontaminated by white Christian missionaries, or even the captives that came and got us, right? So today we're going to be getting into part 2 of, Sephardic and African Jewry. Today we'll be dealing with, the West African ancestors, the West Central African, Sub-Saharan African ancestors, and the traditions and culture that they brought over to the Americas, and how they were indeed Judaic in origin. All right. And we're going to see this influence throughout all of America. All right. It's a lot of people who like to say, show me the traditions, show me the customs, show me where these people said they were Israelites, show me where they practice Judaism. All right. I'm about to bring all that out within this one video. All right. And just continue to prove who we are. All right. We know that when we was enslaved and brought to the shores of the Americas, be it North or South, they did their best to strip us of our nationality, our religion. They did everything they could to, cut us off from being a people, as the Most High said. But today I'm just going to show how, some of our origins were able to stick around and actually be documented. All right, actually be documented. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get into it. Go ahead and get ready to share my screen. And shalom to everyone. All right. You already know, questions, comments, anything, leave them in the chat and I will get to them. And we're going to go ahead and get started today. All right, all right. Let me make sure we good on my end, and then we can get started, family. All right, all right. So European and African Jewry, part 2. African Jewry is what we will be dealing with today. Again. So first thing we're gonna do is get some background history, on the people within West Africa, before we get to America. So when we get to America, we understand where they got these practices from, where they got these names and these certain languages and things that they possess within within the confines of their captivity. So first source to the left, a history of the Jews. Sub-Saharan Jews are very close to the original Jewish population of Palestine. All right, so starting at the highlighted, it says other Jews from the former population of Caesarea fled completely beyond the reach of Rome into the desert to the south. All right, such as the explanation of how the Sahara Desert first acquired Jewish tribes toughened by a fighting tradition and possess physical characteristics. All right, we know physical characteristics, what you look like. All right, which it is said still make them approximately very close the original Jewish population of Palestine. All right, so you want to find a close people or a close population of the Jews of Palestine, you have to go to sub-Saharan Africa. All right, and we know that these Jews would have settled in sub-Saharan Africa or in the Sahara Desert prior to the transatlantic slave trade. All right, West African countries and peoples. 10 tribes immigrated and settled between the Great Niger and Old Calabar River. We're going to start at the very top. It says the 10 tribes of Israel, after they were left to follow the dictates of their own mind, and during the commotion of destructive warfare which ensued them to escape utter extermination, migrated according to the uses of the time in vast numbers into various countries, but principally into northern Africa, as it is thence presented the safest and easiest route. Once settled, every commotion and intestine war had the most powerful effect on inducing these bands to shift their abode still further, and so lose all connection with the other branch of the tribe. As hundreds of years pass on and generation after generation roll away, they lose a great many of their habits and customs, becoming more mingulated with the population of which they associate. But when Mohammedanism overspread northern Africa, destroying by fire and swore all those of another religion, the Israelites' descendants or the people or the inhabitants occupying the central portion of Africa passed forward, seeking shelter to the south and west as part, namely those of the east central, crossing the Benue or Jaluba branch of the Niger, descended gradually southward and became intermingled with the original inhabitants, protected from incursion of the north by the Benue River, and quietly settled between the Great Niger and Old Calabar. They remained in peace and grew from one generation to another into idolatry, but still leaving tangible proofs in the form of their religion of the Judaistic origin of the inhabitants. All right, so once again, we have another source letting us know that, hey, you had Jews within Western Africa, specifically the 10 tribes, and they actually say that they settled between the Great River Niger and Old Calabar. These can be some of your tribes in Nigeria and Ghana, around that location. And again, one of the oldest sources I have before we even get into my people within America, one of the oldest sources I have, I believe 16th or 17th century, this was written, is letting us know that West African Jewry was more numerous and considerable than those within Egypt and Abyssinia. So we're going to start at the highlighted. It says there are some farmers who call themselves original Jews. All right, ain't that what we do in America? Like, man, we the originals. We the original Jews of the prosperity of Abraham, who pretend to have formerly come in colonies and have settled themselves in Egypt, Abyssinia, and along the Niger. And their last are more numerous and considerable than the two former. All right, and these last are more numerous and considerable than the two former. So it's saying the Niger, the Jews of the Niger is more considerable than the two former, being Egypt and Abyssinia. So it goes on to say, but those who came and are there but those who came and are here still. So they were still there during that time within the 6th, 17th century. But those who came and are still there in great number are such as refuge themselves in their parts, either from the destruction of Jerusalem and the dispersion of the Jewish nation by Titus Vespasian, mentioned in a former chapter, or who fled from other persecutions of the Romans, Persians, Saracens, and since under the Christians and out of Italy in 1342, Spain and Portugal in 1462, and out of the Low Countries in 1350, in France 1403, and England in 1422. All these go differently habited and were well as divided among themselves. All right, so we see through these sources that I just brought out, you had Jews and you had, well, basically you had the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom going to Western Africa based off the two sources I just brought out. This letting us know that you had many so-called Jews on the Niger or in Western Africa from various captivities, such as the one by Titus, the Romans, Persians, Saracens, and even coming out of Spain, Portugal, France, and things of that sort. So it was a well and considerable amount of Israelites in this location before transatlantic slavery. All right. And that's important because when we go to how the Hebrews became Jews, it literally tells us that the Hebrews of northeast and West Africa, particularly Ethiopia, are Phoenician. It says they settled from Morocco to Angola. Now that's very significant because that's where our ancestors were picked up from Morocco to Angola, or rather Senegambia down to Angola, and even a few from East Africa. All right. So again, the Jews settled from Morocco to Angola. All right, and it's the same place slaves were picked up, from Senegambia or from Morocco to Angola. All right, so before we get to America, we have to understand once more that we already knew scripture. All right, and we can get this from Black Song, The Forge, and The Flame. When it's starting at the highlight, it says, if the American white man fancies that he was the first to teach the Bible to his black slave, he is quite mistaken. All right, so if anybody says that, they're quite mistaken, they're misinformed, they're uneducated on this topic. The European, the sons of Japheth, they did not enlighten us on the scriptures. We already, had knowledge of it, because, we was in that tradition, basically. A number of the African travelers have tested to the African acquaintance with the Christian Bible. Jobson, for example, writes of the knowledge of Gambian natives to the early 17th century of Adam and Eve, who they call Adam and Ivahaha, Noah's flood, and even Moses. Ellis reports out that Vayu priests traditionally possessed copies of the New Testament in Arabic. They knew the life of Christ and the principles of the Christian faith. And even Mandingos told the story of Joseph, Moses, and David, and even Solomon as their own folklore. And that becomes, more significant when you realize, or when you know that the Mandingos were actually a part of the Bani Israel, quote unquote, Jewish community in Ghana and Mali. All right. The Mandingos will tell you that they are Israelites. All right. And we've already brought out their history plenty before. But L. Starkley found that Fantomon, the Kafir schoolmaster, had the Arabic version of the Pentateuch, the Songs of David, and the book of Isaiah. The unlettered Mandingos entertaining him with the stories of Joseph and and his brethren Moses and David and Solomon. They gave out their stories as part of their own folklore and were much surprised to learn that the white man had heard of them. All right, so what do they mean the white man had already heard of them? If many slaves knew a great deal of the Bible, the whole pattern of the origin and development of the backgrounds of the spirituals in America will have to be considered or reconsidered. All right, so let's get into it. All right, I'm looking at the chat 1 second. Shalom, shalom, family. Brother Neri, I do not know why your message was blocked or whatever, but let's continue. Negro folk music in Eastern South Carolina. All right. Negro folk music in Eastern South Carolina. We're about to get ready to improve our Israelite heritage through our ancestors. All right. So starting at the very top. In the year 1617, Sir John Yamanis, who became the first governor of the Carolina, brought to the state its first Negro slaves. From this time on, the importation of slaves increased very rapidly into 1715. A census revealed 10,500 Negro slaves and 6,250 white settlers. Those spoken of as Negroes, there were many among these slaves who were not racially Negroid. The slave coast from which most of them were brought to this country was the home of only a portion of them. Many of them came from the interiors of the continent. There were some Malays from Madagascar, some Moors from the northern portions of the continent, and even last part one. All right, part one of this video, I brought this out there. Moors and Jews, Sephardic Jews, were being enslaved and coming over to the Americas in the transatlantic slave trade. So not just Moors from northern Africa, but also Sephardic Jews. And the Negroes themselves, the diversity of the tribes was so great that more than 22 or 20 different languages were spoken, to say nothing of the dialects. Advertisement for the sale in Charleston of Gold Coast Negroes, which appeared in 1785, suggested the probability that the Coromantese, all right, Coromantese are Akan slaves, all right. So the Coromantese, who came from the section of Africa, may have contributed largely to the Negro race during its development under slavery. All right. Yes, sir, my brother Neri, I'm bringing that out in this video. I'm bringing this out. So you already know what's going on, brother. But page 2, Negro music can be traced to Judaism and a Jewish type of Christianity. And what I find interesting about this is I believe, I want to say the author misquoted this source where he got this from on purpose, because we're going to actually bring out where he got this source from about Negro music being traced to Judaism. And it's going to say something a little different, but I'm going to bring it up when we get to it. But it says at the top, Gambian Negroes were not uncommon importations and are said to have found ready markets, Sinhalese with their Decidic Arabic strand, Mandingos, Weedas, and on Weedas, or the kingdom of Weeda, that was your Ewe people, Nagos and Faufaus, all industrious and strong, Congos and Gabons, and the yellow-skinned Igbos were offered in the slave markets. All right, so by the middle of the 18th century, the South was seething with thousands upon thousands of these captives from the four corners of Africa, all thrown together upon the resources of a new language and new religion and new moral code. A consideration of the certain distinctive features of the African religion cannot fail to deem or deepen our understanding of the life of the Negro in America, and particularly that life which influenced his music. It says primitive Negro music may be traced to sources in which can be found points of contact with Judaism and a Jewish type of Christianity, and which helped to explain the appeal that the white man's religion of certain aspects of it made him. All right. So again, we know that this so-called Judaism or Jewish type of Christianity, it actually would go back to their West African cultures and societies, as we already really showed earlier. But continuing, we're going to go to the next highlighted, or starting the line before the next highlighted. It says, next to Jesus and often synonymous with him is God. He is a very personal God to the Negroes and is the ruler of the world. In a spiritual collected on the Copper River in the Carolina Low Country, the Negroes sang of Jehovah, all right, in Gullah dialect. It is pronounced Jehovah or Jehovah. All right, and we know Jehovah, like Yehovah, Yahweh, or however you all pronounce it. We know this is the Hebrew God of the Bible. All right, and our ancestors were singing this. And if you look to the right, this is actually a sample of the song. Oh Lord, what have I done? Gone to the mountain. Jehovah spoke. All right, Jehovah spoke. So we see this influence, this Hebraic influence, more than likely brought over from Western Africa. Again, Jehovah or Yehovah, that can be equivalent to the Hebrew Elohim. And we're going to see more influences of this as we continue to go on. All right, next quick source. Black Zion, African American religious encounters with Judaism. It tells us that enslaved Black Christians also fashioned vernacular practices out of Old Testament sources. expressing their most adherent beliefs and ultimate concerns in oral traditions. The spirituals, for example, forged the oral cultural millennium, made consistent use of biblical imagery. He goes on to say, in songs, bond persons declared the dual hardship of enslavement and the burdens of the believer's walk. The spiritual, wrestling Jacob, testified of endurance and struggle as the keys to righteousness. Then my Lord delivered Daniel, recognized human sufferings and God's presence therein. Blow your trumpet, Gabriel, celebrated the promise of future rewards, and still away, I'm going to Canaan land, imparted conspiratory allusions to freedom to otherworldly lyrics. Finally, the classical spiritual Go Down Moses provided the quintessential explications of the slave's identification with Israel. So that's what we have to understand. That's really what we have to understand, that our ancestors actually did call themselves Israelites. This is really nothing new. It's just ignored. These people literally came up with these spirituals, from pre-existing knowledge. All right. But it goes on to say, alluding to the history that both shared as retold in the Exodus narrative. Go down, Moses, way down to Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. So in a sense, when we look at Negro spirituals, this can really be, looked at as sort of oral traditions of our ancestors, that was passed down from Western Africa into slavery, into the centuries folded over until we got out of enslavement. But it says Old Testament imagery also infused African American ritual experiences. Black Christians bought the Hebrew Bible, or brought the Hebrew Bible to life in American-based practices that had been preserved for generations within the slave community. All right, so they was actually able to preserve these practices. So what were these practices? All right, so the soul of Judaism, Jews in African American descent, or Jews of African American descent, it tells us that slaves held tradition or traditional African religious practices drawn from Islam and the Old Testament. So whether a real ancestral connection to the Israelites existed, or as merely imagined, African slaves in North America were uniquely predisposed to identifying with and as the children of Israel. So this is a historical fact that the Negro slaves within American confines considered themselves to be Israelites. And we can actually understand why, because they have this history, or they have this link to West African peoples who have the link to the Israelites. All right. So second highlighted, it says it is not surprising that the sacred world of slave society continued to hold on to many traditional African religious practices, which were drawn from both Islam and Old Testament. So it says the rich biblical imagery often found the spirituals and slave societies in melodies such as Still Away and Swing Low spoke to the strong identification with the children of Israel. Right. So a lot of these scholars coming up that was studying our people and studying their practices coming out of slavery, they actually understood that these people had a strong identification with the children of Israel. And it actually can be traced back to Old Testament practices from their African ancestors. All right, so again, Afro-American Israelites identification goes back to the West African societies. So African Americans have long had a strong metaphorical identification with the Israelites of the Old Testament. Many slave revolts were led by Messianic leaders, all right, and that's very interesting as well. Some identified so strongly with the story of the Exodus that they themselves became Jews. Their world embodied in the Old Testament transcended space and time, past and present, became in one. In the quest for liberation, Afro-American cultural traditions have embraced dramatic reenactments of the Exodus story, while Black leaders have often been envisioned as approximate types of Moses. A number of factors contributed to the Negro's identification with ancient Israel, and this is the major one. So the majority of Africans in North America were brought from West African societies, which regularly practice ritual circumcision, the ritual slaughter of animals, and the separation of women during the menstruation. All right. And we know these are all Old Testament traditions. All right. We know that these are all traditions that our people in West Africa keep or practice, as he just pointed out. So this is where, this so-called identification of Israel will actually come from, their ancestors, the link that they have to these Western African societies and peoples. Again, the author says this was regularly practiced, all right? Circumcision, we know that's biblical. The ritual slaughter of animals, we know that's biblical. And even the separation of women during menstruation, that is biblical. All right? So slave religion, it tells us that slaves followed African and biblical traditions, all right? African and biblical traditions. So starting at the top, important though it is to recognize that the spirituals sometimes express the slave's desire for freedom. In this world, as well as in the next, it is at least as important to understand the profound connection between the other world and this world in the religious conscience of the slaves. Excuse me. Categorizing sacred and secular elements is of limited usefulness in discussing the spirituals because the slaves following African and biblical tradition. All right. And what do they mean by biblical tradition? You see that they'll mention, that they was following quote unquote Old Testament traditions, biblical traditions, but they don't really break down what exactly they mean. Because if they do, they actually just mean quote unquote West African traditions because it's one and the same. When they say African tradition, they really mean biblical tradition. So it says, believe that the supernatural continually impinged on the nature, that divine action constantly took place within the lives of men in the past, present, and future. It was precisely at the worship and praise services in which the spirituals were so important that the contact between God and man became real for the slaves. All right. So again, slaves followed African and biblical traditions. So hybrid hate, Tudor Parfait. Blacks perceive themselves as Israelites. This is a recurrent theme, and we can't just overlook it. We can't just say, it's nothing, when they actually do have a legitimate reason or legitimate reasoning for saying this. All right. So similarly, blacks toiling in the slave farms of the Americans of the Americas perceive themselves as Israelites, toiling in Egypt's bondage. And this metaphorical association fed into the development of new Black Jewish ethnicities in the United States and new religious movements more or less associated with the religions of the Jews. So again, similarly, Blacks toiling in the slave farms in the Americans perceive themselves as Israelites. So, African Americans in the South, there's limited evidence to show that slaves were converted to Judaism. All right. So when people try to say, they saying they Jews because they were converted to Judaism, or they're practicing these biblical traditions because they were converted to Judaism, tell them to please provide the evidence, because everywhere we look, there's that it's a main consensus from these scholars or from these historians that there's limited evidence that these Blacks or these Africans were converted to Judaism by their slave masters. But starting up at the top, it says, at any rate, it is clear that the first efforts to organize distinct Black Jewish congregations began just before or after the turn of the century, and they began in the South. It says some have suggested that the origin of the earliest Black Jewish groups might be traced either to slaves of Jewish slave owners or to individual African-American converts to Judaism prior to the turn of the century. But Bertram Coran, who studied African-American and Jewish relations in the antebellum South, discounts both of these possibilities based on the limited available evidence. All right. So it says, while Quran identifies a number of prominent Jewish slave owners, including Judah P. Benjamin, Secretary of State of the Confederacy from New Orleans, Nathan Nathans, president of prestigious Beth Elohim congregation in Charleston, South Carolina, and Maurice Barnett of New Orleans slave block operation, and Benjamin Mordecai, South Carolina legislator. There's no indication that these men attempted to convert their slaves to Judaism. All right, so skipping down to the last highlighted, it reads, instead, the earliest black Jewish sects were organized by working class men, all right, who were descendants of slaves. As far as it is known, lacked a clear-cut involvement in the white Jewish congregations. And one thing we have to realize, or what people don't actually, take time to think about, is this. When it comes to our Israelite heritage within Western Africa, we did not have quote unquote Jewish synagogues. All right. We did not have quote unquote Jewish temples. We did not call ourselves Jews. So when we come to America and people are like, oh, where's the black synagogues? Where's the black temples? Where's this? Where's that? Where's all this new quote unquote modern Jewish things? We don't associate with that, because from our oral traditions and things like that, we were gone from Israel, way before, I guess you can say 70 AD and things like that. We are Northern Kingdom Israelites. So we don't really identify with those, first temple, new type of Judaism type things. We identify with the Old Testament traditions rather than the new, if you understand what I'm saying. But continuing. So this is the source I was talking about in the beginning, but we're going to go ahead and just read it. Race, Values, and Afro-American Music. This is by Paul Fritz. And you can get this at JSTOR, of course. But it says Negro religion traced to Judaism and a Jewish type of Christianity. What you will notice is when we read from the first source, or the source coming into America, about Negro folk music in South Carolina, it said that primitive Negro music was traced to Judaism and Christianity. But in the original source, it tells us that his religion is traced to Judaism, all right, and Christianity. And let's read this. So starting at the top, it says that primitive Negro religion may be traced to two sources in points, or in both of which can be found points of contact with Judaism and a Jewish type of Christianity, and which help to explain the appeal that the white man's religion, or certain aspects of it, made him. All right. It goes on to say there may have lingered in the background of the slave's mind some dim reminiscence of an Aboriginal African pygmy, pure monotheistic, referred to by Dr. Graham Tinsman, belief in God, the creator, to whom by a resurrection of the body from the dead, the whole man returns after death. All right. And I'm going to skip all this and go down to the next highlighted, where it says the feeling of being God's man, of independence or dependence of him, is a highly developed sentiment among the blacks. One is God's property, and God must provide and care for his own. Baptism was not unknown in Guinea, and 3 and 7 were used as sacrifice numbers. All right, so baptism was not unknown in Guinea, and even 3 and 7 were used as sacred numbers, which is very interesting. But to say none of the least, we actually can see here that this author is letting us know that the religion of the Negro within America was Judaism and a Jewish type of Christianity. So what would the Negro be? Will he be the Israelite like we've been saying he is? Right. So it's safe to say that Judaism was the traditional religion of the enslaved Negro. Right. It is pretty much safe to say that Judaism was the traditional religion of the enslaved Negro. In fact, the first section I have referred briefly to certain fundamental similarities between African religion on the one hand and Judaism and a Jewish type of Christianity on the other, in the virtue of which the Negro in America was enabled to realize some of his own higher potentialities. All right. His religious faith alone made the spiritual great. It furnished the exclusive undertone not heard with physical ears, but which tugs at the heartstrings and softens the spirits of the unbonded. This is the real secret of the spiritual appeals and their pledges. All right. So what we have from this source once more is that Negro religion can be traced to Judaism and the Jewish type of Christianity. So again, who would these Negroes be? So now let's get into some traditions and customs that we can find amongst these Negroes within America. And to do that, we're going to go to a history of Jamaica. All right, a history of Jamaica. And to the right, starting with the highlighting, it says an idea, certainly not of African origin, is still currently, namely, that the room in which a person dies should not be swept or disturbed for 9 days. Water and other requisites are placed in it, and as among the Jews, a light is kept burning during the prescribed period. All right, so we see a Judaic custom amongst the Negroes or the slaves within Jamaica. And we can actually compare that with Numbers 19, verse 11, when it says, he that touches the dead body of any man shall be unclean 7 days. He shall purify himself with it on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day he shall be clean. But if he purified not himself the 3rd day, then the 7th day he shall be clean. All right. Whosoever touches the dead body of any man that is dead and purifieth himself not, defileth the tabernacle of the Lord. And that the soul shall be cut off from Israel, because the water of separation was not sprinkled upon him. He shall be unclean. His uncleanness is yet upon him. All right. And this is kind of what we see being expressed within our ancestors within Jamaica. Again, an idea certainly not of African origin is still currently naming that the room in which a person dies should not be swept or disturbed for 9 days. Water and other requisites are placed in it, as among the Jews, a light is kept burning for a prescribed period. All right. Now we're going to go to Jewish autonomy in slave society. And this is, we'll be dealing with our people in Suriname. All right. Taking a quick second to look at the chat. Yep, they can't handle it, brother. Yes, the Northern Kingdom indeed is still dark skinned, like their ancestors, like you said. So, Purim and his native West African traditions. All right, so we're about to read about a brother named Purim from Suriname right quick, and just look at how he was able to conceal or keep some of his Hebraic or West African traditions within his enslavement. So starting at the top, it says Purim specific birthplace will never be known, since the native province of the vast majority of Africans taken away to slavery in Americas was not recorded. If Purim was born around the mid-18th century, there is some chance, or 41%, that he traces origins to the Coromantee ethnic group, which is in Ghana today. And again, the Coromantees are Akan. And one in 4 possibility that he came either from Mandingo or Luango cultures, also located in West Africa. Purim's awareness of the holiday after which he was called is not surprising, given the importance West Africans attach to the literal and ontological meanings of their given names. Many West Africans and their diasporic descendants preserve a tradition of naming a child after his or her birthday in the week. Moreover, a name could signify a person's spiritual attributes or his parents' mundane events at the time of the birth. Just as Purim had an African birth name, and probably at least one by name, it is also clear that he maintained some spiritual traditions of his native West Africa. In 1782, David de Jacob R. de Mendez, or Meza, discovered the Negro Purim, slaughtering a goat later discovered to be the property of a Portuguese Jew, Isaac Lopes Nunez. When Meza tried to intervene, Purim forcibly resisted. All right. If Purim was not merely seeking a food source or to inflict financial damage of the owner, he may have been sacrificing the animal to a god. All right. And more than likely that was what he was doing. All right. So we see Purim was slaughtering a goat. All right. And if you know the scripture, you know pretty much what this aligns with. But it says he may have been trying to sacrifice the animal to a god or in veneration of one of his ancestors, a common practice to many communities in Angola and other regions within Western Africa. On paper, Purim's act also seems similar to the animal sacrifices found amongst slaves held captive in in Brazil. So we also see that animal sacrifices was common amongst our family, our ancestors within Brazil. It says where local healers played a central role at not only in curing diseases, but also linking living people with ancestral spirits, securing physical or spiritual bulwark, and carrying out purifications and divinatory rituals. And I'm actually going to do a separate video getting into, the West African traditions and, how the Europeans try to say they're ancestral worshipers. They worship multiple deities and things like that. And we're going to really break that down and show you what it really is, because it's not what they say it is. But we're going to leave that for now and continue digging into what we got. But we can look at Leviticus 3 verses 1 through verses 3, Leviticus 3 verses 11 through 12, and get some information. And it says the priest shall burn it upon the altar. It is the food of the offering made by fire unto the Lord. And if his offering be a goat, right, which Purim was just sacrificing, then he shall offer it before the Lord. All right. And even as they mentioned, there's purification rituals that goes on amongst the slaves. You can look at Numbers 19 for scripture reference for that. But again, it's very important because more than likely, again, Purim was sacrificing a goat to the Most High, to our Elohim. And we can see this practice throughout the scripture and other practices as well. So we also have something else that's very interesting. And we're going to start at the highlighted. And it says such use of Jewish sacred objects for protection was not unusual. Decades later, one observer noted that the African descendants population of both Suriname and Curaçao were accustomed to protecting their children against the evil eye by tying a talisman containing Hebrew letters around their little necks. In the 1820s, these charms sold for $3 in Suriname and 5 in Curaçao. All right. So again, the so-called slaves or African descendants within the Caribbean, specifically Suriname and Curaçao, they were wearing so-called Hebrew letters around their necks or Hebrew necklaces. And this is just a picture or example of what this could look like. This isn't an authentic picture or a actual picture of what they look like, but this is very interesting that we have slaves, quote unquote, wearing Hebrew jewelry. And it'll be real good if we can find some artifacts on that or find some, authentic pictures on that, but I couldn't. Or I haven't yet. So again, we can see in the Caribbean, our ancestors or slaves, they would wear these Hebrew necklaces, or rather charms, to protect themselves. So we also have pre-existing taboos that originated within Western Africa. And starting at the highlighted, it says one component of Afro-Creole civilizations in Suriname, clearly derived from Jewish culture, concerns the biblical and rabbinical concept of tarif, all right, commonly rendered in English as treif, an animal or object ritually unfit for consumption or use by Jews. In traditional Judaism, such animal products included fish without scales, shellfish, pork, and any dish combining milk with meat. Already in the 1770s, John Gabriel Stedman noted among the enslaved population a direct prohibition in every family handed down from father to son. So this was within every family within this location, and it was passed down from father to son against the eating of one kind of animal foods, which they call treif. Although enslaved Africans sometimes describe their prohibition as treif, and it could coincide with the Jewish religious practice, all right, such as the avoidance of unscaled fish. The taboo among slaves could be inherited from a parent or acquired, was individualized, and was supernatural in origin. All right. And we know that this will actually come from, our West African ancestors, not what they saying, it being supernatural rather than ritual. And this would actually be ritual. But it says the use of the word and concept amongst slaves and their descendants show a remarkable continuity into the next 2 centuries. So this actually went on 2 more centuries after it was documented. Whether or not the word and practice truth were imposed by Jews or their slaves, or enslaved people adopted the word to describe a pre-existing system of taboos that had originated in Western Africa. So they're saying this so-called taboo or this coast or this practice that they have, it originated within Western Africa. As some scholars have argued that the phenomenon is further evidence of the blurry boundaries of cultural exchange, a phenomenon we will further explore within chapter 5. So, right, so we can see the Levitical laws amongst our ancestors. Scripture reference, you can look in Leviticus 11, of course, clean and unclean foods such as pork, shellfish, etc. This was practiced amongst some of our ancestors down in Suriname. All right. Continuing. It's also interesting because we can also find so-called African Jewish tombstones in the Caribbean as well. And here's one of them. And this is coming from the Jews and the expansion of Europe to the West, 1450 through the 1800s. It says in the 19th and 20th century, Sephardic cemetery in Paramaribo, the heart-shaped Sankofa and Okoma symbols appear, right? And we know that the Sankofa bird is really so-called what we call West African, all right? This is in the Khan culture, the Sankofa, this is within the Ga culture, and even the Ewe culture, all right? And it said it coincides with the Star of David, the Hebrew name of the deceased, and the typical Sephardic flat horizon tomb, all right? So it says this was thereby forming the only uniquely Jewish African tombstone in the New World. All right, so that's very interesting. I just wanted to throw this within a presentation to just I guess give the possibility or show that this could be attributed to a descendant of a slave based off all the other information we've already brought out. All right, so now we're about to get into the book Hebrewisms of Western Africa. All right, and we're going to start at the highlighted. And we're going to be dealing with OB or Obeya. All right. And starting at the highlighted, it says the word OB itself is really the Ashanti Obeifo, a witch, or rather more properly in practice at least according to Captain Ratreri, a wizard being derived from Bai sorcerer. All right. So we see what's going on here. Now it gets real interesting because we can look in the scripture and we have a similar word and meaning for OB in the Hebrew, and that is ob. OB, it means a bottle or necromancer, and that really is nothing but a wizard or a sorcerer. If you were just to Google this word necromancer, it would tell you like wizard or spirit or sorcerer. All right, and even down here under the other definitions, it tells us medium spirits, or wineskins. All right, so and we also see some scripture references in the scripture where OB or Ob is mentioned, and it says in Leviticus 19:31, regard not them that have familiar spirits, neither seek. Deuteronomy 18:11, or a counselor with familiar spirits, or a wizard. So that would actually be like Ob or OB in replacement for the familiar spirits. And it's also interesting because in the Akan culture, this actually means OB actually means like unfamiliar spirit or a wizard or a sorcerer, the same thing that is hinted to in the Bible. And it gets really interesting when we look into scripture because we can see that Saul actually dealt with Ob or OB. All right. And we can read this within 1 Samuel chapters 28 verses 3 through 20. And we're going to read all this because it's kind of interesting, and it goes with what we see with the Obeah influence in the America by way of the Khan. We can see that it goes back to a different source, which is actually our Hebrew ancestors. So we're going to read this starting at verse 3. Again, Ob in the Akan traditions is like a spirit, familiar spirit, a wizard, things like that, or a sorcerer, and it's the same meaning for the word Ob, which we're about to get into within the Hebrew and in the scripture. So starting at verse 3, it says, Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him, and buried him in Ramah, even in his own city. And Saul had put away all those that had a familiar spirit, or Saul had put away all those who had Obiah or Og, and the wizards out of the land. And the Philistines gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa. And when Saul saw the host of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart was greatly trembled. So we have to understand what's going on here. And so just make sure you're paying attention so you can understand, the context of this. Now, verse 6, it says, And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. So the Lord was not listening to Saul. He was not dealing with him during this time. Then said Saul to his servant, Seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit. So he really says, seek me an old woman. Seek me a woman of Obi. All right? That I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, Behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Ender. And Saul disguised himself and put on the raiment and went, and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, I pray thee, divine unto me by the familiar spirit, or by the Obi, and bring him up, whom I shall name unto thee. And the woman said unto him, Behold, thou knowest what Saul had done when he had cut off those that had familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. Wherefore then layest thou a snare for my life to cause me to die? So she's like, you know what Saul did? He already casted away all the OBs, so all the Obs out of the land. He already cast all these spirits out of the land. Now you want me to bring them back and cause me to die? Verse 10, and Saul swear to her by the Lord, saying, As the Lord liveth, there shall no punishment happen to thee for this thing. So verse 11, it says, Then said the woman, Whom shall I bring up unto thee? And he said, Bring me Samuel. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice. And the woman spake unto Saul, saying, Why hast thou deceived me? For thou art Saul. And the king said unto her, Be not afraid, for what sawest thou? And the woman said unto Saul, I saw God ascending out of the earth. And he said unto her, What form is he of? And she said, An old man cometh up, and he is covered in a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel. And Samuel said to Saul, Why hast thou disquieted me to bring me up? So what we actually see here is the same situation, or the same exact thing that the Khan was reflecting with the OB within Jamaica. We can look within scripture and see that Saul, or Samuel, was literally raised from the dead to communicate with Saul. We can see that a woman was able to use the Ob, or the OB, as the Akan say, to bring Saul back from the dead. Now, am I saying this is something we should practice? No, I am not. But I'm saying we can trace these things of our people back to the nation of Israel. And here's the example. Samuel literally was brought from death. He said, Why hast thou disquieted me to bring me up? And Saul answered, I am sore distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God is departed from me and answered me no more, neither by the prophets nor by dreams. So the Most High was not listening to Saul. So guess what he did? He said, I'm gonna go and deal with the Ob then. I'm gonna go deal with the Obiah. And that's what he did, and that's what's reflecting right here in scripture. Therefore I have called thee, that thou mayest make known unto me what I shall do. Then said Samuel, Wherefore then doest thou ask me, saying, The Lord is departed from thee, and become thy enemy? And the Lord have done to him as he spake by me. For the Lord hath rent the kingdom of thy hand, and given it to thy neighbor, even to David, because thou obeyedest not the voice of the Lord, nor executed his fierce wrath upon Amalek. Therefore hath the Lord done this thing unto thee this day. Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with thee into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow shall thou and thy sons be with me. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel to the hands of the Philistines. Then Saul fell straight away along on the earth and was sore afraid because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no bread all the day nor all night. All right. So again, this was just to show that just as you can find OB or Ob in the Akan culture, you can also find it within the scripture. And here you go, right here, 1 Samuel 28, verses 3 through 20. This is the exact same thing. Continuing, some Jews said to be descendants of, some slaves said to be descendants of Jews mixed with Negroes. And guess we can start at the very top. It says, as a matter of fact, Hebrewisms of Africa derivation are not confined to Jamaica along with the West Indian Islands. So there's basically saying these Hebrewisms, these Hebrew traits or traditions, they are not just limited to Jamaica or the West Indian Islands. Blair Niles, in her recent delightful little volume, Black Haiti, speaks of the slaves from Africa possibly or positively asserts that some were said to be descendants of Jews mixed with Negroes. All right. And that can just be her saying that they're Jews mixed with Negroes because they're black, right? But it goes on to say that Dr. Prince Mars, whom she quotes as an authority, also claims a distant Semitic infiltration in the antecedents of some of the San Domingo slaves. All right. So we have a quote saying that some Jews or some slaves were said to be Jews within Haiti. And we also have them letting us know that it was a Semitic infiltration within the antecedents of the languages within the San Domingo slaves. All right. So everywhere we look, we see these Semitic influence, these Hebrew influence within our traditions and cultures as a quote unquote African people. We can even see Passover tradition amongst slaves within the Virgin Islands. And it starts at the top. It says, this may seem to us less strange when we read the testament of Reverend H.S. White, head, who is speaking from the information gained at first hand on the ground. All right. So he's speaking from information gained at first hand on the ground. So he was there. While insisting that the appropriate term, worthless old Carthage, current today in the Virgin Islands, is to be traced back to the African Carthage of Punic Wars, he also remarks that on the doors of the Negroes' cabins in the country, outside the towns, crosses may be seen, much like those of the Hebrews made with the blood of the Passover lamb. And this is to keep the wuss out, one slave would say. And of course, we can find a reference to this within Exodus 12. And they shall take of the blood and strike it on the strike it on the two side posts and on the upper doorposts of the houses wherein they shall eat. All right. So again, on the doorposts of the Negro cabins in the country, outside the towns, crosses may be seen, much like those of the Hebrews. All right. So again, we can see Passover traditions amongst the slaves within Virgin Islands. All right. So that's very, very important again. And we know that this tradition, this influence will come back from their West African ancestry. So early slaves spoke of the Hebrew Elohim. All right. Early slaves spoke of the Hebrew Elohim. So the supreme being amongst the Ashanti is Nyame. All right. Some people like to pronounce it Inyame, but it's Nyame. All right. Yame or Yahweh. Yame or Yahweh. So the supreme being amongst the Ashanti is Nyame, whom we shall later try to identify with the Hebrew Yahweh. All right, we've already done extensive work proving it, so we don't really have to worry about that. But he says his primary title is Inyakapon, meaning Inyame, a long great one. Akapan them appeared to be the white man's effort to express the spoken Inyakapon as heard from the earliest slaves. All right. And again, the white man would say a compound opposed to a yakapon, which the early slaves would say. All right. So the early slaves would say yakapon, meaning He who knows everything, or even Nyame alone, great one. All right, and we know Nyame or Nyame is the same as Yahweh or Yahuwah or what, etc. However, the brothers in the Western world pronounce it. But again, this Akan God will go back to the Hebrew God of the Bible. So we see actually two references of slaves within the Americas, within the United States amongst the Gullah, and even in Jamaica amongst those peoples, them being able to, I guess you can say, keep in contact the name of the Most High of their ancestors, right? Again, Yahweh or Nyakapon, and as well as with the Gola or with the Gullah Geechee singing Jehovah. Jehovah, all right? We can also see Semitic languages on pews of church that was built by slaves, all right? And this is coming from the First African Baptist Church website. It says the solid oak pews were installed in the main sanctuary during the early 1900s under the leader of the Sabbath pastor, Reverend James Wisely Carr. The pews located in the balcony are original to the church. These pews were made by enslaved Africans and are nailed into the floors on the outside of some of the pews are Semitic languages that consist of cursive Hebrew, Ethiopian Amharic Ge'ez, and ancient Aramaic from the 1800s that's no longer spoken or written amongst modern Semitic languages. Do you know how big this is? All right. That our ancestors were still speaking these Hebraic and Semitic languages while they was building a church enslaved in the Americas in the 1800s. And some of these languages are not even spoken to this day, but our ancestors were able to retain it. You don't see people speaking or writing cursive Hebrew today or ancient Aramaic. So that's just something for you all to think about. And everybody else to think about who denies our ancestry. So Black Jews in Africa and Americas. It's possible that Equiano or Aluda Equiano, he could have been talking about Hebrew customs amongst Igbos within America. All right. And if we start at the top, it says Equiano's book fully merited its sensational reception and went into a number of editions. His text, however, is famously problematic. There is an ample reason to be cautious about those parts of the book that purport to be firsthand accounts of his early life in the Igbo village, given the grave doubts recent scholars have cast upon both the date and the place of his birth. Nonetheless, there's a general agreement that some of what he wrote about the ethnography of the Igbos appears authentic. Clearly, the main point of this passage is the comparison between Igbo manners and customs and those of the Jews. The comparison itself obviously does not come from his childhood memory, nor does he say it does. The passage conveys the kind of general impression Equiano might easily have gleaned throughout his life from Igbos he met in America. All right. And if that's true, that means Equiano was able to recite animal sacrifices, purification laws, all right, Levitical laws, all these type of ancient Old Testament traditions and customs, which he put in his book. If it is true that he was talking about Negroes in America, that's just even more telling to the fact that we are who we say we are. So again, Tudor Parfit is proposing that Eldad wasn't talking about Jews within Equiano actually. I mean, not Eldad, but Equiano was talking about Igbos in America opposed to Igbos in Western Africa. And either way it goes, that's still pretty big if he was talking about Igbos in America. So, quick source or quick article actually. Rabbi Earl Bowen Jr. speaks about African American Jewish history. In his lecture, part of the Golden Slippers Gem Summer Series, he touched upon the role African American Jews played in larger Jewish communities in the history of Philadelphia's Black Jewish community. Bowen traced his origins or traced the origins of Black Jews in America, noting that the first African American Jewish communities formed in the later half of the 19th century. And if you're talking in regards to communities, yes, that would be true. In the early 1800s or 19th century, there were that is where you started to get your first Black Jewish communities or temples or synagogues. But it says the ancestors of those people had been slaves taken to America or the United States and converted to Christianity. At the time, they began to equate biblical stories about the plight of the Jewish people, quote unquote, as slaves in Egypt to their own experiences. Slowly, they began to adopt Jewish customs, which I disagree with. They actually retained their own Jewish customs from Western Africa, and then started their own congregations in the early 1900s. And actually, the earliest Black Jewish congregation was actually in 1850. Right, this was before the end of slavery. So you had a so-called Black Jewish synagogue or temple or congregation going on while we were still enslaved. So that's just some information to throw out there as well. But he goes on to say, Bowen said that there is a bit of evidence to support the idea of some slaves were Hebrew before they were brought to the United States. All right, and there's I just brought out a lot of support and evidence to show that these people were indeed Hebrews before they came to the United States. That culture, however, was destroyed along with the rest of the culture identifies of the slaves or the identities of the slaves. So in a sense, Bowen says, Blacks embracing Judaism is a revitalization or revitalization of the point of view and a continuation of a history that was once lost. And that's true. Once we start to come back to who we are, we search our history, we turn back to the Torah, we start turning back to the traditions and customs of Israel. We're just doing a continuation of what was cut off from us, because of slavery, because of Jim Crow, because of civil rights, because of integration, because of things like that. We've been, I guess you can say, hidden from the truth of who we are. So, another article. Blacks, Jews celebrate what may be a common history. So, the question is proposed, was Haiti settled by descendants of ancient Israelites and Judeans escaping the slave trade in Africa? Some of the members of Montreal's Black community believe so, and they continue to identify as part of the nation of Israel. In fact, they think the name Haiti, the world's first independent Black state, is derived from the Hebrew word ot, a word for miracle, just as many place names throughout Africa are today. Black History Month was commemorated at the Segal Center for Performing Arts with a presentation by the members of his community who traced their ancestry to the 10 tribes that fled from the biblical kingdoms of Israel and Judah after being conquered by foreign invaders. They believe the exiles went south first to Egypt and over the centuries migrated across the circumference of the African continent to the West Coast. And historical evidence backs that up. The highlight of the evening, which was held at Segal's Cinema Space, was the screening of excerpts from 1995 documentary Los Noirs dans les Camps Nazis by Serge Bao, which brings the light to the little-known fact that Blacks mostly living in France were imprisoned during World War II and persecuted under the Nuremberg laws. And even you have a Sephardic Jew who was Black that was being persecuted by the Nazis during this time, and he was even sent to the concentration camps. But guest speaker Thomas Vandal, a native of Congo who settled in Montreal in 1999, said he grew up with a strong sense of being Jewish, at least in the pre-rabbinical era sense. All right, so that's what we mean, at least in the pre-rabbinical era sense. All right, so that means like Old Testament traditions and customs. That's what I keep telling everybody, or keep expressing. That's mainly what our ancestors dealt with. Old tradition and customs, pre-rabbinical era traditions and customs, rather. His family followed the traditions set out in the Bible: circumcision, not eating blood, not mixing meat with dairy, and observing Shabbat or Sabbath, for example. All right. They referred to themselves as the house of Joseph. Even before the exile of the tribes beginning in 721 BCE, Vander underlined that there were strong ties between quote unquote Africans and Israel. He goes on to say he believes that many of Africans and those Africans or those of African origin today, particularly Bantu people, all right, and we know this is true as well. We can back this up. Particularly Bantu people are the descendants of the two Hebrew kingdoms. The very word Bantu is derived from Hebrew, they believe, all right, and Bantu actually comes from the word people. So Bet or Betu or Bantu. All right. So if you look into the Bantu language, people actually means or transliterates to Bet or Betu or Bantu. But it goes on to say if they are Christian or Muslim now, it is because the history of colonization and conquest, he said. All right. So again, this article is just bringing the fact that, you know, the people that's in Haiti, they do have Israelite ancestry. And they even proposed the question, was it colonized by these peoples who came from the kingdoms of Israel and Judah? And it's even letting us know that these Bantu peoples and their descendants in America, they would be of Israelite extraction as well, from their oral traditions and customs, all right? Not from the white people's ideology, not with what the white people say, but from what our ancestors say. We are the people who we say we are, and we have the information to back it up, traditions and customs. So, about to get ready to wrap it up with a few quick sources. The Valley of the Dry Bones, Rudolph R. Windsor. It says, let's start at the top. So by the 6th century, the Black Hebrew Israelites had increased in such large numbers that they were found throughout the Middle East. They had at least 2 kingdoms in southern Arabia and Ethiopia, large settlements across North Africa and the Sahara Desert, a kingdom just south of the Senegal River. There was the Hebrew kingdom of Ghana, and there were numerous Hebrew Israelite settlements along the West African coast as far as the country of Angola, right? Didn't I tell you all already that the Jews settled from Morocco to Angola? So this is where we should expect to see these people. Some of these Hebrew Israelites converted to Islam. Others amalgamated into indigenous African tribes, and many were transported as slaves to America, all right? So when we say Israelites was transported to America as slaves, we pretty much can prove that, as I just did. Judea trembles under Rome. It tells us that the Israelites spoiled the iniquities of the nations by suffering for slavery, persecution, and oppression, as the African Hebrews suffered in America. All right, so we have here again. The Negroes or the Africans in America would be Hebrews, would be Israelites. The history of Edom and Khazariah. All right, the history of Edom and Khazariah. It says at the conclusion of the historical overview, it will be possible to formulate an accurate understanding on how, as a people, the children of Israel came to be geographically located in the Western Hemisphere, lost, bewildered, stripped of their true culture and heritage. From Ethiopia, Egypt, and Central Sudan, descendants, the Ashanti, and the tribes known as Bantu, states Andre Achim in his book La Guinea Francisca. This is indeed the case, and the fact that the group in question is indeed descendants from the children of Israel. All right, who? The Akan and the Bantus, or the Ashanti and the Bantus. They will occupy the main thrust of this section leading up to the time of the slave trade, when literally millions of Israelites, millions of dispersed Israelites were brought to the Americas on ships in bondage. All right. So I pretty much just verified these last 3 sources we went through, you know, showing the traditional customs of the Negroes in America, showing you that these people called themselves Israelites, showing you the ancient Israelite presence within West Africa before the slave trade, all right? And showing you that these people, traditions, customs, and religion was actually a form of Judaism and a Jewish type of Christianity. All right. So again, millions of dispersed Israelites were brought to the Americas on ships in bondage. All right. Not a few, but millions. So we're about to get ready to wrap it up with this source. And the source to the left is called the Papyrus. And we're going to start at the highlighting. But it says that these colored Hebrews claim to be descendants of the original chosen people. And they prove it too, out of that book, which proves everything, the Bible, all right? So again, the colored Hebrews that claim to be descendants from the original chosen people, they actually prove it. They prove it out of the Bible, all right, which proves everything. They contend that there has been a misreading of Scripture and a total misunderstanding or perversion of Shem, Ham, and Japheth legend. They affirm that Ham has been formed from the uppercut cross countered and short arm by the churches and theologians on the side of his brothers. They pretend that the Jews were primitive blacks like themselves and that they adduce certain facial or physical points of resemblance between the Negro or between the Israelite and the Negro, all right? They regard the Jews as degenerated members of their own race, slaughtered off in the process of evolution. And they view them in much of the same light as the despised white tribes of the South. The position taken by these colored Hebrews is extraordinary to say the least, but to candid mind, it seems quite tenable, as many of other contents held as established in the Bible. The colored Hebrews are close observers of the Mosaic laws, all right, just like we saw in Western Africa. This is what their ancestors was doing, practicing Mosaic laws. So the colored Hebrews are close observers of the Mosaic law, and nearly all the ancient Israelite customs govern the tribe or family, all right? And this is within America right now. We're not dealing with West Africa. We're dealing with the colored Hebrews within America. And they're telling us that they observe the laws of Moses, and the ancient Israelite customs governs them by tribe and by family. All right, third highlighted. It says, but in every other important detail in the black Hebrews are said to conform rigidly to the statutes given throughout the Moses to the chosen people, all right? So again, but in every other important detail, the black Hebrews are said to conform rigidly to the statutes given through Moses to the chosen people. So this is what our ancestors did in Israel. This is what our ancestors did through migration throughout Africa. This is what our ancestors did when they settled in Western Africa. This is what our ancestors did when they came over here in slaves. And to wrap it up, and if anybody has any questions, concerns, or comments, go ahead and put them in the chat. But again, whether the colored Hebrews will succeed in getting themselves accepted as the regular Simon Pure Palestine brand of chosen people may be the argument. But there is no doubt at all that they have forced themselves to the front as a new and divergent feature of the Holy Show. All right. And with that, that's the end of the presentation, family. I really hope you all enjoyed it. Brought out a lot of information. You know what I'm saying? Get out of this real quick. Let's see. Stop screen sharing. All right. Yes. All praises, honor, and glory to the Most High Yah indeed. So, we showed the traditions and customs of the American Negro from the United States all the way down to the Caribbean. All right, we showed what their ancestors was practicing. We basically showed how the Negro was practicing a form of Judaism within his enslavement. We show how he was able to attain certain customs and rights, such as sacrificial rights, purification rights, certain Passover traditions they still kept. The Negro spirituals were basically our traditions. We pretty much brought out everything. We brought out the I guess you can say the presence of ancient Israelites within Western Africa way before the coming of the transatlantic slave trade. All right. And we show that our ancestors actually perceived themselves to be of the Israelite nation. All right. They knew that they were of the Israelite nation. All right. They wasn't just saying it to say it. They were saying it because they believed it and they knew it. All right. So again, if anyone has any questions, concerns, or comments, please drop them in the chat. If not, man, I thank you all for tuning in today. Wrapping up this, I guess you can say this series, Sephardic and African Jewry. You know, bringing out the history, just showing that from both sides we have Israelites coming in. We have Israelites coming in from the Europe side. We have Israelites coming in from the African side. So, you know, you really can't deny who we are. And while we waiting on questions, I'm just going to play a couple videos. And after these videos get done, if there's no questions or anything, we're going to wrap it up. All right. But these videos pretty much agree with what we just brought out. All right. Let's see. What should we watch? All right.
Many of the Jews of Nigeria also reject the idea of DNA testing, questioning the need to prove their faith when Western Jews aren't required to do the same. On the flip side, DNA testing has helped many African Americans discover their own Igbo roots. Actor Forrest Whitaker and Bishop T.D. Jakes have discovered genetic links. So a Jewish-Igbo connection could begin to raise questions for many African Americans.
Many African Americans actually do not know that they have Igbo heritage. The chances of their being Igbo is much, much higher than their chances of coming from Ghana or from Western Nigeria.
If you're from the right county in Virginia, you probably have a 60% chance of having Igbo ancestry. I would say probably the only country in the Americas that would have a higher Igbo rate would be possibly Jamaica.
The Igbo are a very, very big part of the African American, as far as the United States go, African American history.
Igbo culture and tradition is in North America and in a lot of African American families and definitely in Gullah Geechee families, but people don't know that it's Igbo. So it's here and it's sort of just under the surface where you just got to pull at that fabric just a little bit and then get a real peek at it. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, but we. And before we be your slave, we going be buried with grave and going home till we go and be free.
I'm back here with Remy from the Igbo tribe out of Nigeria. I'm Amari Stodham out here, and we're speaking about the Israelite diaspora out of Nigeria and then through the Atlantic trade slave ship into America. So Remy, can you give him a few words about it?
Yeah. As Amari has said, I'm Igbo. The Igbos are composed of exiles from Israel, Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews. There were Igbo people that left Israel and moved to West Africa when the Northern Kingdom was destroyed and when the Southern Kingdom was also destroyed. Jews left and moved into what we know as West Africa now and formed the Igbo people and thrived there until the Europeans came and destroyed the societies and took away very vital parts of the Igbo population, which ended up in the Caribbeans and in what we know as the United States today. From the Igbos, we are taking the majority of the Africans that ended up in America and in the Caribbeans.
Yeah, and that's why we're here today, because we're studying the lost biblical tribes of Israel, and we're giving you a quick timeline on what took place during the times of the Israelites migrating into Africa, forming the Igbo tribe. And then from that, you have the translated slave ship that took all the Israelites into slavery in the different parts of America. And this is why you see me here today, because I am a direct descendant from the ancient tribes of Israel, and my family definitely traveled here to America by way of slave trade from Africa.
Yeah, he got it exactly right. And in fulfillment of the same prophecies that I've had him and Harry talking about, they are reconnecting. Some of them have done their DNA, and it links them to us. Like somebody like T.D. Jakes, DNA proved him to be Igbo, just like DNA recently proved me to be Israelite too. My DNA showed definitive traces of Middle East. So what he said is in line. DNA confirmed the history.
Keep it locked right here, man. Stat Academy, giving you the truth, the facts about the biblical tribes of Israel. Peace.
Thank you for the encouraging words, my brother. Thank you. I can make sure I continue to bring out this information as best as I can. All right, and I'm looking at the poll that I put out for everybody to vote on for what they want first, or what do they want to get into. I see that what came up, second most wanted on the list was the genetic history of I believe it was Shem. If not, no, that's not it. It's actually Japheth dwelling in the tents of Shem, genetic breakdown. So I guess we can get into that either sometime this weekend, more than likely this Shabbat. So I'm gonna give you a few more minutes just to see if anybody has any more questions, comments, anything like that. And if not, man, I appreciate you all for watching. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you share it. You know what I'm saying? Make sure you go back, take notes. If you need sources, don't hesitate to reach out. I got you. Just make sure yes. All right. So with that being said, family, I will see you all this Shabbat, man. Thank you for tuning in today. Torah.